Good afternoon. This is Guillermo Sabatier, your host today on Perspectives on Energy. And I'm also Director of International Services for HSI, the Health and Safety Institute. And today we'll be talking about renewables and their impacts on energy security. So can we get to net zero, but how safely can we do that, right? Okay, again, welcome to the show. And this is like a series on renewables and energy security and reliability. So a few weeks ago, my last episode, we talked about a little bit on what the training needs are for the distribution operators and how renewables are affecting that, mostly in a great way, but there's a few challenges. Today, we're discussing going more in depth of specifically on energy security and reliability. So one of the things we're going to talk about today, well, a few things, of course, will be the penetration of renewable resources that are mainly just hinging on either solar, utility scale, or wind, and apparently that seems to be the market that predominates most of the renewable resources out there that are coming into market right now. Mind you, there's a whole swath of rooftop solar that I'm very excited about as well, because that in itself presents a great deal of opportunities. And couple that with electric vehicle and chargers and batteries and that sort of residential type energy storage, you have the chance to be able to leverage that as many basically what they are, little distributed energy resources. That's what you call them. But think of them as small little power plants located throughout the system, all the way down to the distribution circuits, which will be a great opportunity and a great resource to leverage if it's managed correctly. Right. So before we get into that, I'll talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that we wanted to cover today really is my views on, well, what I've seen rather on us approaching, for example, what they call the renewables knee. And that's what's happening where it comes to utility scale solar, utility scale wind, approaching a point where for every other additional site or resource that's added, the incremental cost, it's increasing not just incrementally, but at some point has like a slightly exponential effect. So those are things we're beginning to see now. The other challenge, of course, is it appears that in a few years, NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the one that does a lot of the regulatory work for the FERC, the FERC, they may be changing some of their requirements and standards to maybe encompass further into the station and further into the generators for these renewable resources. One of the things that's interesting is that, for example, they forced a lot of like setting changes in the protection systems in order to make them ride through frequency and voltage excursions. And that was a great thing for reliability operations, right? However, for the generator owner, generator operator, or the owner of these renewable facilities, during a fault or during one of these issues, that presents a liability for them in the sense that it exposes their equipment and that resource to some potential damage, right? But again, that's the price for reliability. So if they want to be connected to the grid, there's different tiers when it comes to staying online, depending on the level of excursion, the level of voltage disturbance or frequency disturbance. They will either stay online, they will either stop injecting current, they can completely come offline and come back on in a matter of seconds, or they completely trip off and not come back for at least 4 or 5 minutes, right? So all of that has its effects. We've seen impacts of that both in California a while back during those wildfires, where they pretty much had to shed load. Or we see it as well in Texas recently, when they had problems with inadequate or a capacity shortfall in some cases. So one of the things we're looking at, right, as far as getting to net zero, or some companies that call it real zero, right, where they're experimenting with hydrogen storage. So one of the things they're looking at is generating hydrogen out of the variability and the excess of these renewable resources. So they're storing this gas on site. That's one of the which is a great idea. How you quantify that cost right now? It's still in the R&D phases, but I know that a few companies already have those facilities on. They broke ground and they're working on it here, at least in Florida. We see there's at least 2 sites that are doing that right now. One of them is owned by Florida Power and Light or Next Era Energy. Another one I think is being owned by Duke Energy. And the other thing that we're experiencing as well is, and this is something that we've noticed in quite a while, was the fact that until recently, right, the utilities, the operations, the reliability entities weren't really invited into the conversation when it came to renewables legislation, right? And now they finally are. And we're finally beginning to treat it almost as a, not a commodity, but more like a national security resource. And rightfully so, right? A lot of these foreign governments are treating this, they're weaponizing our own climate policy against us. And in some cases, right, we're accelerating ahead with the deployment of these renewable resources. Now, it'd be great if there was a great variety of them and you didn't rely on just 2 types. Problem is that we seem to be leaning heavily on solar and wind, and there's not enough storage yet. It's be wonderful if we could have enough storage where we could have that as a resource, and then we be a lot more reliable. But at this time, the level of deployment just isn't there. Hopefully we'll get there. But the challenge we're seeing is the fact that, as we approach our renewables need, as we approach this variability, we're seeing, for example, in some places in the Midwest, they're having to dispatch nuclear power plants. This is base load generation day ahead. And that's in response to the renewables variability that you're going to see in the middle of the day the following day. Now, this is concerning because of the fact that you're backing down reliable, steady state base generation that has a lot of inertia. And at the same time, you're trying to prop up the renewables with these settings where they'll ride through disturbances. And eventually that has its limit. So this whole racing ahead at any cost, right, might present itself in a very dangerous situation when it comes to the grid reliability and grid security. Which for me, for example, one of the things I've noticed is that usually in a lot of these, a lot of the proponents of this particular resource, right, when you notice it, not many of them are. Some of them are, but not many are electrical engineers. Very few of them have ever worked in the electric utility industry. And for the most part, what I've also noticed is a lot of these proponents of this resource are stakeholders in the manufacturing side of these devices or facilities. So at the same time, then you begin to question the credibility, and you begin to observe some bias when it comes to the implementation, or rather the promotion of these particular resources. I wish I was wrong. I wish it wasn't the case. I would love to have somebody prove me otherwise. I mean, if there's anybody out there who's a seasoned electric utility professional that went to work for the renewable resources and that decided to, and has like a deep understanding of grid reliability, I would really love to hear from them and kind of post something in the comments below. And I'd love to have you on the show at some point, because what I've seen is not very many of the bodies that are promoting these resources really have a stake in grid reliability. They more or less have a stake in either environmental policy, or they have a stake in the manufacturing and selling of these devices. So anyway, hopefully that isn't the case. And what I've seen, at least on the utility side, is that they're finally at the table when it comes to reliably deploying these resources long term and in the planning process. Now, that being said, this new renaissance of nuclear energy, right, that we're seeing not just in the U.S. but globally, right, was really brought on by this dangerous race ahead towards these like renewable resources that only basically circle around solar and wind, right? And that is the product of that problem. Eventually, you have to get that base load from somewhere, right? And nuclear for a long time was no new plants are being constructed, but now apparently we're seeing the benefits of this whole zero emission resource that has not really been developed much in the West. You see a lot of different companies in the East have actually invested quite a bit on over a dozen different new technologies, right? So here, what we might see a lot of is those small modular reactors and micro reactors. But in places like Korea, for example, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're already full on. They have 2 units running in in the Emirates, and they have another facility planned in Saudi Arabia, and so that's coming. And ideally, it's as as a player in this market and a former leader in this market, right? It would really behoove us to actually once again become a serious competitor, if not once again a leader in this particular technology and in this industry globally. So there's definitely a lot of pushback in the idea of nuclear at this time, and I can understand why, right? There's always that concern for an environmental disaster. So not quite the case when it comes to these SMRs. They have a lot of these passive cooling and safety systems, so you're not unlikely to see something like if a Fukushima happen again, or much less a Chernobyl. However, one thing I do worry about is security. From what I understand, these units are completely sealed, and the amount of fuel is rather small. But at the same time, this is always a concern. But one of the things I've seen is that these things can be rather very well guarded from the remote location. So it was yet to be seen what kind of system they put in place to be able to control that. So the other thing is the one thing I see a lot of hope in my personal opinion, right, is the advent of, well, not the advent, really, it's the utility dispatch of these distributed energy resources at the customer level, right? Whether it's a commercial, industrial, or even residential type of resource, whether you have solar panels on your roof, or you got an electric car in your garage or your driveway, or even a whole wall full of batteries, right? Ultimately, this is a resource that you could manage, along with the fact that you may have demand-side management of all of your appliances. So all of these become a very useful tool, right, that the utilities can leverage in order to ensure reliability, keep down cost, and at the same time, imagine offsetting the need to have to build new transmission lines, having to build new power plants, having to avoid the expanding an easement for a transmission corridor. Now you can just rely on the fact that you're feeding power all the way back up again through your distribution system into your transmission system. So that would be a huge advent, right? So and when it comes to helping reliability, imagine supporting voltage all the way down to distribution levels, where for the most part, power quality issues have been a real problem in most of these distribution utilities or co-ops or even municipalities. So when we think of that, right, it's one of the recently I had a speaking engagement at Tech Advantage, where I spoke to a lot of the distribution cooperatives. And one of the things that we were noticing is that throughout the country, I think it was about 38% of the customers were already thinking about getting rooftop solar and batteries. And about 11% of them were already moving on and doing it. So just think about it. It's as you're approaching 40% of your customers are beginning to think about it. So in another year, right, those that are thinking about it, the ones that remain, they haven't thought about it yet, are going to start doing that, and the ones that haven't pulled the trigger and moved on investing on these resources probably will. The other important thing is that the year-over-year increase on rooftop solar alone has been about 39% from November of 2021 to November of 2022. That was a 39, almost a 40% increase, which is, these numbers are oddly familiar, but 40% increase on rooftop solar deployment when they measure it in the amount of kilowatts or megawatts overall throughout the country. So that is a really important, significantly important thing when you consider what this will look like a few years from now. At the same time, right, it's for the utilities to be able to control that resource, both storage and generation through photovoltaics, right? It's you might get to the point where you're going to have a dispatch of combustion turbines at certain times of the day, whether it's the morning peak and the afternoon peak, and then eventually retire your baseload generation. But that's a very dangerous thing to consider, unless, of course, you have control of those distributed energy resources, or even control with the aggregators, right? So again, without a doubt, once we get to that stage, yeah, I can almost bet money that we're going to see NERC getting into the business of putting in standards that are going to penetrate deep within the distribution systems, right? And then you can also bet that these aggregators, these that manage all these DERs, and then these independent power producers are going to have more of a compliance exposure when it comes to how they impact reliability. Or more than likely, what they might end up doing very well is they'll recede further back and kind of try to sell off their substation assets and only own up until the actual collector of those resources. So for them, the substation would probably be something that they'd rather have the utility own and take on the compliance burden as opposed to them. But of course, that's yet to be seen. NERC and FERC may pretty much not allow that to a certain point. And so that'll be interesting to see what happens there. Now, the other thing that I was noticing as well is the true cost of some of these new technologies, right? I remember at some point I was invited to go look deeper into I think it was Blarney. There's an island in Scotland that they have a full renewable resource capability when it comes to total megawatts. But for them, any given day, right, they're either importing power from the mainland through a submarine cable, or they're running some fossil fuel resource. So they're not. It's not often where they're running everything on renewable energy, right? For them, a lot of times they have pretty much like a 50-50 mix on those resources. So I did reach out to them and hopefully I can have them on a show and in some time from now. But that is the truth when it comes to that island. One of the things I wish to point out, though, of course, is the fact that that would be really easy to maintain 100% renewable if your load was flat throughout the day, flat throughout the night. Unfortunately, though, is very variable, and then having a generating resource that has a load following capability is now adds a little bit of more of a challenge to it. It needs to be responsive, and that on its own has its own limitations. So again, it's great to see a big variety of different renewable resources, but when you capture the true cost of those devices, it's not really commercially feasible yet. But I'm optimistic that we're moving towards the direction of economic commercial feasibility for most of these resources. Because ultimately, right, utilities are very risk averse, and rightfully so. And that becomes even more impactful on a municipality or a cooperative. So for them, that sort of impact is it can be more devastating if it's a bad decision. So these larger utilities, vertically integrated utilities, part of a larger parent company, they can absorb some of this like R&D expenditure, right? Where you can see in a lot of these larger companies doing this. But when it comes to these like smaller co-ops and munis, it's a little bit of a challenge. So anyway, and the other thing, getting to that net zero safely, I think when I refer to that in the title of my show today, is the fact is net zero, or how about real zero, right? Because there's a few companies that are already working towards that. The net zero is that a net effect, right? You're still producing some carbon emissions, but the ones that they're not producing kind of like counteract against that. Ultimately, I can see where that they're going to want to retire even those like relatively clean or natural gas fired combined cycle plants, and then try to replace those with some kind of renewable resource. More than likely, I think that will eventually be nuclear, especially small or micro reactors. One of the things that I think will be great to see, but we all don't have the geography for it really, would be pump storage plants. And that has been around forever, reliable, really prices well quantified. We know what they cost. And those can be run many times a day, in and out. And then, of course, they're great for storage. They're great for peaking. They're great for even recovery from a disturbance or contingency. So in that case, right now, mind you can only have those in certain parts of the country. Geography matters, but there are some run-of-the-river type of storage facilities that actually can and have been implemented recently, but there aren't that many, sadly. Usually there's a cost issue with those as well, right? But yeah, we're making strides, making progress, and I think finally we're understanding, right, the impact some of these resources have on reliability. I think the utility scale solar, utility scale wind is facing some new challenges now because of the proper quantifying of cost, mainly for the type of generating resources that they displace. Problem is that happens during the middle of the day, and that's usually displacing baseload generation which on its own is pretty cost effective. So we shall see where we're at, but definitely excited about what's coming, and hopefully we will see more. And I look forward to having some of these new guests on the show in a couple of episodes from now. So stand by and more to come. All right. So again, any comments, any invitations, any challenges, or I definitely invite you to leave comments below, and then hopefully we can have a conversation, and I can invite you on the show, and perhaps you can educate me as well, because I can always learn a few things. But 30 years in the industry, in the utility industry, I can definitely tell you that I've seen some challenges come up when it comes to renewables, and from a system operator perspective, right, having to train them. Having to train operators and simulation, one of the things that we're challenged with now, of course, is putting these distributed energy resources in our distribution simulator, and having the distribution dispatcher manage the flow coming back from the feeders, right, and into their distribution buses, and then of course feeding back up to the transmission grid. That is definitely an interesting challenge. A lot of our clients have been asking for that particular feature in the distribution simulator, and we now have both the distribution side and the transmission side finally linked together, so we can actually have a joint drill of both sides, which they've also been requesting. And then we're seeing quite a bit of the joint training happening between distribution entities and transmission entities. So again, more to come on that. And again, I invite you to visit hsi.com in industrial skills, so you can learn more about our utility training program, system operator training, and then also NERC test prep. It's a whole NERC test prep program where we prepare you to take the NERC exam, and either it's an online self-paced course or even an instructor-based training program where usually have a pretty good success rate on once they take part in that program. So again, thank you again, and have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you again in a few weeks. Bye.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.